voice, so you don't probably need to be too close to the microphone. All right, Joe.
Would you please state your name and spell your first, middle, and last name?
Roberts Caleb Engle, RobertCalebEngle.
Do you go by Caleb to most people?
Yes, ma'am.
And some people in your family, do they call you Robert?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Burnett Chapel Church of Christ?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you go there?
I have.
And how long did you attend the church?
Most of my life, throughout, I would say 3 on up until me and my wife had gotten married, and we've been going back and forth between churches.
Okay, so sometimes you still attend the Burnett Chapel Church of Christ, sometimes you attend somewhere else.
That is correct.
Okay. I want to call your attention to September 24th, 2017. Did you attend the Burnett Chapel Church of Christ on that day?
Yes, ma'am.
Was there anybody else in your family who was at the church that day?
Yes, ma'am. My father, James Engle, and at the time, my girlfriend, Bailey Inman, we had all met up there for service.
Okay, and you say at the time your girlfriend. Are you now married to Bailey Inman?
Yes, ma'am.
And does she have a different name now?
Yes, ma'am.
Bailey Engle.
Bailey Engle.
Okay. When you got to church on that day, were you there for the entirety of the service?
That is correct.
And was there anything unusual about the service right up until it ended?
Nothing at all.
Where were you seated that day?
We were seated up towards the front near the pulpit over in the left-hand corner.
Okay. And were you sitting with both your dad and your then fiance or then girlfriend?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. When church ended, what happened?
When service had ended, we had kind of turned to each other and made some small talk. And then we heard some popping sounds. We were thinking fireworks. And as, excuse me, we heard fireworks, or what sounded to be fireworks. And right as soon as we were going, I was trying to make my way over towards the right-hand side of the church to the windows. We had heard them approaching closer.
You heard what approaching closer?
The popping noises.
Okay.
And as soon as I had made it about midway to the right side, that is whenever I had seen a masked gunman enter the building.
Tell me about that.
He was wearing what I would believe to be a black leather jacket, black pants, and a mask.
Could you see whether or not there was anything in his hand?
Yes, ma'am.
What did you see?
I believed it to be a gun of some sorts.
Okay. Did you hear anybody saying anything at that time?
At the time, I do not.
Okay. When you first saw him, what was he doing?
He was, he had walked in and turned right towards the ladies' restroom. The whole way, he was extending his arm and casually maneuvering the weapon in his hand.
Could you tell whether or not he was firing the weapon as you saw him turn right towards the ladies' room?
Yes, ma'am.
How many times did you hear him fire the weapon as he was in that particular area?
At the time, I can only recount 2 shots.
Okay. And what was going on inside the church when all of this was going on up there in the vestibule area?
Most of the people had turned, they had started running down the little hall towards the men's baptistry on the right-hand side of the church.
Okay. So you saw some people running towards the baptistry.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you see anybody else in the church react in a different way?
Not that I can recall.
How did you react when you saw that?
Initially, I had ducked down in between, I'm still towards the pulpit. Between the first and second pews, I had ducked down and would slightly stick my head up and look around to get visual on him, to see where he was going.
What did you see?
I had seen the people running into the baptistries, and then I had ducked back down, and shortly thereafter I looked up and he was maneuvering around.
Where was he maneuvering around to?
He was initially going in front of the baptistries, and then he had turned around and made his way up to where the pulpit would be.
Okay, and then what did you see?
He had started going towards the entrance, up the middle aisle.
Okay, kind of like the center aisle of the church.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so he was going from where Minister Spann would be giving his message towards the back of the church.
Yes, ma'am, towards the vestibule.
And I really don't want to speak for you, but he basically has made a circle now.
Yes, ma'am, sort of a U shape.
Okay. And what is he doing when he's going up the aisle?
I just recall him walking,
Okay.
kind of in a leisure, half hurriedly pace. I believe that's whenever the adrenaline started rushing and I had tunnel vision.
Did you hear him say anything?
No, ma'am.
Did you hear him fire a weapon at that time?
At the time, I did not.
And then you said you started having tunnel vision. Can you tell the jury about that?
The tunnel vision, I had focused on him, seeing where his next move would be. And time had just slowed down to where you could not really tell how fast or how slow things were going.
Could you see where the people who were sitting around you, where they had gone, if anywhere at all?
I could not.
You're focusing on him.
That is correct.
What did you do?
As soon as he had passed me going up the main aisle, I had got up and started following right behind him. And as soon as I was an arm's length away, I remember reaching down and trying to grab his firearm. And I ended up grabbing his leather jacket and ripping it around the cuff. He had then turned around and pistol whipped me. I can recall between 3 to 5 times on the top of my head. After he had pistol whipped me, this was towards the vestibule now. I had dropped down to my knees and scurried into the right side of the pews and hid in between there. From there, his back was towards the vestibule, and he had walked all the way back up towards the pulpit. And I was peeking up from between the two pews, and that is whenever I'd seen him coming back towards the vestibule again. And I had stood up in front of him. I remember standing up in front of him, and he extended his arm. And the only thing I can remember is I just shoved my left arm out in front of him. And then I heard a gunshot. And we had stood there for what seemed like an eternity. I had looked down at myself and I looked up at him, and then he fell down to the floor. From there, I remember shouting, "The shooter is down. Is everyone okay?" And everyone who was hiding in the baptistries shortly thereafter came out. Everyone that was hiding under pews has sprung out. My father, again, he came up from between the left side of the pews, middle aisle. He had come up, asked me if I was okay, if I'd been shot. I said no, I was pistol whipped. He comes over, kicks the gun away from the attacker's hand, and then he asked me where my gun was. I said, it's in the truck. He said, go get it. From there, I had walked in a very hurriedly haste, I had walked from the vestibule up towards the pulpit, and I hung a right to the classrooms that would lead out to the parking lot. From there, I went through the hallways, went out the exit door to my black Ford F-150 pickup truck where I'd left my firearm. I grabbed it and walked back up through the front. And I remember as I was walking up through the front of the church, I had passed a vehicle that was running. And I thought that was either Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins' vehicle running, and didn't really pay much attention to it. From there, I had gone back in, planted my foot in the small of his back, and I had pointed my firearm at him. And I remember I said, I have a .45 caliber with hollow points, loaded, pointed right at you. You move, I wouldn't shoot. And then shortly after that, first responding officer, I believe it's Officer Odom, showed up. And he had instructed me to lay my gun aside, and I did. He had told me to sit, take a seat, and he had reached for his gloves inside of his vest, and he said, stand back over him. I left my gloves in my squad car. And so I got back up and watched him. And as soon as Officer Odom came back in with his gloves on, I sat right back down. And then from there, EMS, EMTs, everybody seemed to have shown up from them. I do not remember which officer, but I do remember one of them unmasking because I was looking at him the whole time, making sure he wasn't about to spring up. I remember them unmasking him, and one of them asked me, have you seen this guy before? I had said no. At the time, I did not know who he was.
Later on, did you realize who it was?
It wasn't until the news reports and me and another member of our congregation, I believe it was the night after, we were standing around speaking and we were putting the connection together.
Did you realize that you actually knew that person from the past?
Yes, ma'am.
How did you know him from the past?
I more so remembered the group of guys he was with and the times that they would help us in our vacation Bible school and all the things that they would do around the church and how helpful they were, how great they are. And that is whenever all the connections were made.
Okay. And how long had it been, do you think, since those gentlemen attended the church?
I would probably say 4 years. I'm not too certain.
Okay. And when they would go to the church, can you tell the jury whereabout they would sit?
They would usually sit towards the front and the right-hand side up front near the nursery. The same exit I took to get to the parking lot.
Of those people that you're saying that you remember coming to the church during that period of time, is one of those persons here in the courtroom today?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you point at that person and indicate where they are and what they're wearing?
It would be this gentleman over here with a gray suit, purple tie, and blue shirt.
Your Honor, may the record reflect he's identified the defendant.
Yeah, the record will show reflect.
Okay, Mr. Engle, I want to go back to some of the things that you were describing a little bit earlier. On the second time, when you approached the defendant, was he facing you when you approached him, or was he not facing you?
He was facing me.
And you said that you put your arm out? Okay.
That is correct.
And you said that he also had his arm out.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you describe for the jury how he had his arm?
He had his arm extended with his weapon in his hand,
Okay.
as if he was about to discharge.
Okay. And where was that gun pointed?
It was pointed at me.
And where on your body was the gun pointed?
I would have believed around my left side,
Okay. And you're indicating near
around
your mid-chest. Is
That-
that fair to say?
That is correct.
Your left chest just under your shoulder.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when you approached him, what exactly did you do?
At the time, I just remember extending my left arm out as if I was trying to push.
And did you touch any part of him or anything that he was holding?
At the time, I do not remember doing that,
Okay.
physically touching.
And by this time, you had already been pistol whipped. Is that right?
That is correct.
Are there some of these details that you're a little fuzzy about?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'm going to hand you up some exhibits, A through F. If you could just look through those exhibits, Mr. Engle, and you don't have to go one by one, just look through them and see whether or not there's anything in there that's familiar to you.
There is.
Okay. Are those photographs, what are those photographs of?
They are of different types of handguns and what I believe to be a knife.
Okay. Is one of them your handgun?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Your Honor, I would offer those as collective exhibit number 13 and ask to show those to the jury. I'm showing you photograph A. You can point on your screen and it'll draw a picture. Can you draw a picture of the weapon that you recognize as yours?
It would be this one.
Okay. And I'm showing you photograph B. Is that an up-close picture of your weapon?
That is correct.
And C, is that yours?
Yes.
And D?
Yes.
And E?
Yes, ma'am.
And F?
Correct.
Okay. Did you ever fire your weapon on that day?
No, ma'am, I did not.
Your Honor, may I retrieve exhibit number 12, the Pharaoh scan? And Your Honor, I'll be using that to ask some more questions of Mr. Engle. Yes, John. Mr. Engle, I'm showing you what we've already entered into evidence as exhibit number 12. Have you looked at the photographs on this exhibit before?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, do you remember coming to our office and looking at some pictures
Oh, yes, ma'am.
on this? Okay. Okay, so I'm starting with outside number 4. And can you tell the jury what we're looking at here?
This would be the outside of the front of the church building.
Okay. And I want to ask you, you said that after the first time that you after the second time that you encountered the defendant and after you left the church to go out to your car, is this the door basically that you left out of? Is this the side of the building that you left out of?
Yes, ma'am. Right where your cursor is.
That's where the door is that you would have left from.
Correct.
Okay. And do you see in this photograph the vehicle that you saw running?
I do.
And can you point at your screen? I don't know if that's going to work. Okay, that's not going to work. Is it this vehicle, this vehicle, this vehicle, or this vehicle? What color is it?
I believe it was the blue one.
Okay, this one right here that I'm pointing at?
Correct.
Okay. And is this an accurate depiction of the outside of the church on that day?
That is correct.
And for the record, I'm putting the picture hallway 2. Is this an accurate depiction of the inside of the church if you were just walking in?
That is correct.
Okay, and for the record, I'm clicking on inside 16. Okay. Can you tell the jury whether or not this is the area where you were sitting on that day?
Yes, right behind though.
Okay, and you can touch your screen and show the jury where it was that you were sitting.
Okay. It was back here. If you were to do a 180,
Okay.
but from where I was sitting, that is the view that I had of the pulpit.
And is that where you were when you first realized that the defendant had entered the church?
No, ma'am.
Okay. You had walked over to a window, you said.
I was on my way to the window.
Okay. And which window were you going to?
I was trying to get to this one or that one.
And how far did you make it?
I say that I would have made it about close to here, near the communion table, and
go ahead. What did you do when you got near the communion table?
that is whenever I had seen him enter the building.
And what exactly did you do when you were at that spot?
I had went and hid at this pew. Uh-oh.
I can clear it and you can start over if you want.
Okay. I had went from here to between these two right here on the furthest side, the right side.
Would this have been, and for the record, this is inside 14, would this have been about the view that you had when the defendant came in?
That is correct.
Okay. And can you point on the screen where it was where you first encountered the defendant?
Where I first encountered was right here.
And was that about the place where he pistol whipped you?
I believe so.
Okay. And you can push clear at the bottom of your screen, and this will go a little faster for everybody. There you
Okay.
go.
I was not aware of that, sorry.
Well, I wasn't either till just a second ago. So that's where you encountered him the first time. Can you show the jury where it was that you encountered him on the second time?
Roughly around the same area, just a few feet more up, closer towards the vestibule.
Okay, and can you push clear for me?
Yes.
And for the record, I've moved to photograph inside 9. Do you recognize anything in this photograph?
I do.
What do you recognize?
I recognize the mask right here.
Okay. And is that the same mask that you saw the defendant wearing?
It is.
Is that the same mask that you saw the police officers take off of the defendant?
Yes.
And can you tell the jury whether or not the same person who that mask was taken off of, is that the same person who's here in this courtroom today that you just pointed out earlier?
It is.
Is that the same person who went with the paramedics and the police officers on that day outside
It is.
of the church? Okay. And I'm now, for the record, going to inside 16. I'm sorry. Do you recognize anything in this photograph?
I do.
What do you recognize?
I recognize the firearm right here.
And whose firearm is that?
I believe it to be the defendant's.
And why do you believe that?
I had seen it in his hand.
And how did it get to this location right here?
After the final confrontation, when he had fallen down, the gun had dropped, and my father had kicked it away from him to keep. He had jumped up to keep him from grabbing that one and causing more damage.
And did you see it actually land in this area right here?
Yes.
You said that could you push clear for me? I think you did, okay. When you saw the defendant walk into the church around this area, you said that he went to the women's restroom, or was going towards the women's restroom. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
So that would have been going towards this area right here. Is that right?
That is correct.
So he would have taken a right to go right there. Is that right?
Correct.
And then when you said that he came up the side of the church towards the baptistry, would that be going towards around the church this way?
Correct.
would that have been the baptistry? Is the door to the baptistry?
Yes, ma'am. The door to the men's baptistry.
And is this the door that goes to the Sunday school classes?
Yes, ma'am.
And is that the same door that you went out when you went along the side of the church to go out to your car or your truck?
Correct.
Did you see the defendant pause at any time near the baptistry, in between the baptistry and the nursery?
At the time, I did not.
As all of this was happening, can you tell the jury whether or not you saw anybody else be injured?
I personally did not see anyone injured. However, I did see the aftermath of the ones injured.
Can you please tell the jury about that?
As I was coming back in from the building, or from the parking lot into the building, I had stepped over several people, and I clearly remember seeing Mr. Jenkins at the front door, propped up from where he had been injured. And then I'd walked in and seen Mrs. Spann laying on the floor. And it wasn't until I had went to go clean the blood off of my face that I'd seen Mr. Spann as bloody and pale as he was. And then it wasn't until the EMTs, paramedics had arrived that I had truly seen who else was injured.
Who else did you see?
At the time, I'd seen Catherine Dickerson, Mrs. Jenkins, and I believe Linda Bush.
And what type of injuries did you see on them?
At the time, I could not tell. There was blood everywhere. On clothing, on floors. I was dripping blood too, so I was slightly foggy. But I clearly remember seeing them.
Did you see members of the church assisting other members of the church?
I did.
Can you tell the jury about that?
We have several medically trained. We have two nurses and 2 Navy veterans who I believe were corpsmen. They were going around assisting injuries of the people who had been shot, checking vitals, seeing who all was life-threatening and who all needed professional medical attention first.
I'm directing your attention back to the Pharaoh scan inside photograph 9. Can you show the jury where you held the defendant on the ground when you had your foot on his back?
Between right here.
Okay, and can you draw an arrow showing which way his face was pointed?
His face was pointing this direction.
And if you earlier. I want to ask you a couple questions about your injuries. You said that you were pistol whipped several times on your head. Did you have to go to the hospital for that?
I did.
Can you describe for the jury how you were treated at the hospital?
I will say I was treated very, very quickly. They had cleaned my head injury. They had sent me for a CT scan to make sure I did not have any concussions, brain damage, and they had somehow stopped the bleeding. But after they concluded that I had no concussions or brain injuries, they had put staples in.
How many staples did you have to get to your head?
I would want to say between 7 and 9.
Do you have scars on the top of your head now from this event?
I do.
And did you receive any other injuries besides the pistol whip to your head?
Yes, ma'am. My left shoulder had gotten dislocated.
Okay. Do you remember whether or not that was from your first interaction with the defendant or the second interaction with the defendant?
I do not remember.
You said that your shoulder was dislocated.
Correct.
Was that painful?
A little bit.
And did it require you to go to physical therapy?
It did.
How long did you have to go to physical therapy?
I would say a month and a half.
Okay. And how long did it take for you to get cleared to go back for work because of that injury? Go back to work because of that injury?
They sent me on light duty whenever they had first cleared, got me into physical therapy with restrictions. But after physical therapy was completed, they released me onto full duty. I would say, all in all, a month and a half to go back to full duty work.
And what kind of work do you do?
I work in a HVAC warehouse.
And when you were going to physical therapy, can you tell the jury what it was that what you were receiving the therapy on? What specific trouble were you having?
I was having trouble elevating my shoulder and arm past neck level. Now I can bring it up over my head, move it around normally, front and back. Before physical therapy, I did good just to raise my forearm.
And did it take you the full month and a half to be able to raise your arm over your head?
Yes, ma'am.
And I believe those are the questions.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Engle, I'm Jennifer Thompson. I'm representing Mr. Samson. I wanted to ask you a few questions. One is, you said that you remembered Emanuel Samson from the church with some other people. Did you remember his cousins, Isaac and Moses, that came with him?
Yes, I was not aware that those were his cousins.
Okay, but you remember the other gentlemen that came with him to church?
Correct.
And they'd attended for a while, hadn't they?
Yes, ma'am.
How long would you say that they had attended the church?
I would say about on and off 2 or 3 years.
Okay, and you said one of the things that they participated with was Vacation Bible School.
Correct.
Matter of fact, Emanuel Samson worked with the children during Vacation Bible School. Didn't he?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, you have to answer out loud for the court reporter.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
I understand what you're saying, but... and he was very good with the little children, wasn't he?
That is what I'd heard.
Okay. And You said he had done a lot of things for the church. Can you think of some of the other things he had done for the church?
Other than volunteering, we're at pretty much any event, the primary one being Vacation Bible School.
But he had volunteered for other events also.
I believe so.
I mean, the church does all kinds of different service projects. Like, actually, I think the day before this incident, you'd had a garage sale at church. Isn't that right?
That is what I'd heard. I did not go.
Okay. But he'd actually been very active in the church when he was attending.
Yes, ma'am.
And there was no animosity between any of the members of the church that you knew of and Mr. Samson.
No, ma'am.
Matter
There
of
was
fact,
none.
he'd been pleasant and seemed to have gotten along with everybody, hadn't he?
That is correct.
And you heard maybe the pastor, because you've been in here during the testimony, weren't you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you heard the pastor, Joey Spann, say that the church is an interracial church, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
It's not solely a white church with white members, is it?
No, ma'am.
So, Mr. Samson, and you didn't know it was him at the time because of his mask when you initially confronted him. But when you confronted him the second time, or when you came up to him, you said you held out your hand, and you don't even remember that you had any physical contact with him, do you?
I do not.
You just held out your hand, and the next thing you said you remembered was the gunshot.
That is correct.
And that's where he shot himself, isn't it?
I believe so.
He shot himself in the chest. Did he hold the gun up and shoot himself in the chest?
Yes, ma'am. I believed it to be around his shoulder area that I can remember.
If he were shot in the pectoral muscle, would that make sense to you based on what you saw?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know what that is, the chest muscle?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so after this had happened and you had taken your heroic steps, your father got up and came over and said, "Go get your gun." Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
But it turned out that Mr. Samson actually had a second gun on him in a chest holder, didn't it?
That is what I'd heard, yes.
Okay. And your father, if while you had run out to the car, it is possible that Mr. Samson, had he really wanted to get away or fight, could have tried to fight your father and get that second gun.
Objection calls for speculation.
Saying disregard the question.
Okay. Your father didn't have a weapon on him, did he?
No, ma'am.
And so, as far as you know, and I think you may have said this earlier, no one else in the church had a weapon on them except for you that you knew of at the time, right?
I did not have it on me at the
Okay.
time.
Right. But they're close to the church. Nobody else that you knew of had a weapon close to the church or in their car that you knew of.
No, ma'am. Not that I knew
Okay.
of.
So when you went out to your car, the only person that was guarding Emanuel Samson, it was your father standing over him. Isn't that right?
I believe so.
And your father was unarmed.
Yes, ma'am.
And Emanuel Samson had a gun in a chest holder, a gun in a chest holster. I'm sorry, can you answer out loud?
Yes, ma'am. That is what I'd heard.
And a knife, actually, and also in his vest. Isn't that right?
I do not remember seeing the knife.
Okay. In those pictures that you looked at, do you remember seeing the knife on the pew in the pictures that we just saw, the scan, the Pharaoh scan?
I do not remember seeing it on his person.
Oh, okay. But you do remember it later on?
From picture evidence, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. And while you were standing there inside the sanctuary, nobody was shot while you were in the sanctuary, were they?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And how many minutes or seconds would you say it took him to just walk around before the entire episode was over? Once he entered the sanctuary, how many minutes or seconds do you think that took?
I'm not too certain. As I had previously stated, it seemed like time had slowed down. I would speculate between 15 to 20 minutes, but it seemed like a good 60 to 120 minutes that it all unfolded.
Okay, so it seemed like, you said 60 to 120 minutes, like it seemed like 1 or 2 hours?
Correct.
It kind of all went, okay. And because Mr. Samson had been a regular attendee, he would have known in that sanctuary where the exit was, the same exit you took to go to your car to get your gun, or your truck to get your gun.
Yes, ma'am.
He would have known that was an exit that way, wouldn't he have?
Correct.
Okay. No further questions.
Please leave it.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Engle, to this very day, do you remember how it is that your shoulder got dislocated specifically?
I do not remember to this day.
Okay. So there had to have been a little bit more of a struggle than what you actually remember.
I would assume.
Anything further?
No further questions.
May he be excused.